The Packer. This story is one of the most frightening things that happened to me in my life, and I am not even good at talking about it. You will learn the consequences of that later, but seeing that I'm writing it now, I believe it should be easier and clearer. When I was younger, I used to go to camp with a friend of mine every summer. His father worked there, and so in exchange for helping around, we would be allowed to play there too. And so every summer, Scott and his father would appear before my home in their RV, and they would drive me off. But on that particular summer, I'd done something unbelievably stupid. I'd been so excited about leaving that I left school a bit earlier than expected. When I arrived home, my mother was so surprised to see me. After nagging her for a long time, she finally relented and drove me to Scott's home. She dropped me off with my bags. Then after quick cheek kisses, she drove off. I stood by the sidewalk in the pouring rain, and then it kind of dawned on me that because I came here early, I'd have to wait for Scott and his family to arrive. I must have stood there for 30 minutes, leaning on different legs, and the rain at this point was ferocious, with the winds blowing very hard. In my desperation, I ran over to hide under the porch of the house, and that's when I saw that the door was slightly opened. Now you can imagine my complete disbelief and slight irritation. All along I was standing there, yet the door was open. But I should have been more than just irritated. For some reason, I remember not wondering why the door was open, and also I didn't ask myself how it was open, yet I couldn't see anybody in the house. Which reminds me, there was nobody in the house. I made 2 trips to grab my bags and put them in the TV room. It was when I dropped my dead body on the couch that I first heard it. A low tapping sound. I didn't have to check to know that it was the sound of footsteps. I assumed that Scott was in the kitchen, packing up the meals, and I had to go to his room and get the blankets, the bug repellent, and the torch. So I went to his room and I packed the things, but no matter where I looked, I couldn't find the torch. Knowing Scott, there was no use asking him where it was, so I called Scott's mother. We spoke for a bit, and I asked her where the torch was, since I couldn't find it in the cupboard. And that's when something odd happened. She got quiet, and then she told me that Scott took it to school. Then she asked me if I was in their house. At this point I was starting to get weirded out by the way she was speaking. She sounded confused and surprised. I told her that Scott opened the door for me and that I'd asked him for it. And to confirm it, I called for Scott, yelling into the room. And that's when 2 things happened. First, she made a surprised sound and told me that Scott wasn't home. He was still at school. And secondly, the busy noises coming from the kitchen immediately got silent. Lightning struck outside and the network became blurry. At this point, I heard pots falling in the kitchen. If that wasn't Scott, then who was it? I was scared senseless, and so I tried to speak to her through the phone. I could only make out stay and house. Also, I could make out the panic in her voice. I didn't know what to do, but I just couldn't wrap it around my head that the person wasn't Scott. So I slowly walked out the room and headed to the kitchen, expecting to see Scott. But there was no one. And then I walked to the TV room. Again, I saw nobody. I walked around the house and there was not a single person there. Finally, I came to stop at the corridor and figured I must have imagined what had happened. But then, the lightning flashed outside and the flash lit up the dark corridor, and for a split second, it was like it was daytime. And I saw a man standing at the end of the corridor. He was dressed in black with black gloves, and strangely, he was also wearing patient's clothes. His eyes were wide, showing all the whites around his iris. But the creepiest thing were his lips. He wore a massive grin on his face, which widened when he saw me. Then a second later, the brightness disappeared, and it was all dark again, except I could hear the man rushing to me. I hate to say it, but I screamed like a little baby, and I ran so fast I hit my hip on the table, but it didn't stop me from making it out of there. I ran out into the pouring rain, and as I screamed, I could hear loud, unhinged laughing. When Scott's family arrived, we looked around the house and we found that the guy hadn't stolen anything, and so we have no idea what he'd wanted there or what he could have done to me. The Noah. The year was around 2018, August, on the 9th, and the time was around 9:38 p.m. I know the very details of this story because at the time I'd been waiting for a movie to play on TV. But then a massive thunderstorm hit our neighborhood. It was completely unexpected, and it was so bad that it knocked out the power. At least that was what we thought had knocked out the power, but in hindsight, it was probably knocked out by another hindrance. But for now, we didn't know that. All I knew at the time was that I was going to be missing a movie I'd been waiting for 4 weeks. And I was in a pretty terrible mood. I got into my pajamas and jumped into the bed, and I just sat there for minutes, feeling angry. I glanced at my phone's time every now and then, just hoping I could slow it down so that I would wait for the movie. 8:12, 8:20, 8:32. The time just kept going, and I was starting to lose my mind just watching it go. And also, I was starting to get very drowsy. The last time I checked the time was around 8:50, and then I don't remember much after that, until I heard what sounded like hands clapping. As I listened closer, I came to realize that it actually sounded like bricks were being grated against each other. And so it was that I finally opened my eyes and looked around me. I panicked, seeing how I'd fallen asleep, and I checked my time to see if I hadn't completely missed the movie, but the time was only 9:23 or 9:18. To be honest, I don't remember exactly at this point, but I know that it had not been 30. Something else happened at 9:30. For now, I just sat there and suddenly remembered the grating bricks. I wondered where that sound had come from, and I looked around my room. It was dark, and my bed is right next to the window, meaning whatever light that is supposed to come into the window so I can see around is often covered by my own body, and so I couldn't see anything in the room. And even worse, I felt a strong sense that I had to go and pee. So I got out of bed and gave up on the search. Slipping on my slippers, I headed out the door, shutting it behind me and heading to the toilet. When I came back from the bathroom, I opened the door, but I paused for a moment and crouched to fix my sleeper. And then something immediately stood out to me. There was a lot of wind in the room. It was quite chilly, and looking around, I immediately found the cause. The window was wide open. It was around 9:30 by now. When I'd left the room, I knew that I'd heard something that sounded like bricks grating. I knew that I'd heard that, but I also knew for a fact that the window was wide open. I know I hadn't checked, but it must have been closed, otherwise I would have felt the cold, right? Well, I didn't know the answer, but I knew that by then I was completely weirded out. I shut the window and locked it. Then I got back to bed. Once more, I tried not to sleep, but again, I couldn't hold myself for too long. Soon, I was in complete darkness. Then the thunder came. The thunder was stronger than anything I'd ever heard through the night, and I knew it before my eyes even opened. The window was opened again, but when my eyes opened, I discovered something new. There was a shadow that fell over me, and outside my window, there stood a man, his teeth exposed to me. I didn't scream. I jumped up and grabbed the window and pushed it down. The man snarled like some animal and pushed the window up, but it was easier to push down than anything. His mouth slobbered, and for some reason, his eyes started rolling around in his head. Now that made me scream. I called my father, and the man snarled at me. It was only seconds before the door slammed open and my dad stood there. The man turned and ran away from the window, jumping off to fall all the way to the floor. We called the cops on him, and after that, my mom and dad let me sleep in their room until the cops found the lunatic. And as it would turn out, every other house had power, even with the thunderstorm. It had just been my home that had no power. The Pretender. So, I was at the bus station not too long ago. It had been raining rather severely, far worse than I could have ever imagined, and yet I had to wait for my mother to come get me. So there I was standing, right next to a pillar, and the rain was pouring centimeters from my face. I waited there for so long for my mother to arrive that other people's cars came to take them. Soon, I was left all alone. At least that was what I initially thought. When I looked around, I realized that no, I wasn't alone. Standing a distance away was a group of these guys dressed in black. They didn't look friendly at all. They weren't even speaking with each other. Instead, they sat in complete silence. But what really terrified me was their eyes. Their eyes were looking around the place, looking for something, or better yet, someone. And I decided it probably would be for the best if they didn't find me. So I hid behind the pillar with my trunks. I stayed there for a very long time before I decided to look around and see the men. I did this a few times, but then I peered around one last time, and all of them had turned their heads towards my pillar. They caught me. I hid behind the pillar again, feeling completely stupid. It was too late now, because they'd seen me. I knew that, but at the same time, I didn't want to look like a complete wimp. So I stepped out. When I looked at them, I noticed immediately that some of them had walked closer. There was one sitting on the bench closer to me, and another leaned on a pillar close to me. I took my bags and pretended as if I was looking for a car in the rain, but in truth, I was walking further away. When I was far enough, I turned and saw that they were pointedly trying not to look at me. Yet, they had irritated looks on their faces, so I thought I was free for a while. But when I looked back, I noticed immediately that they veered closer again. I don't know how I missed it, but it had happened. And so this time, I pulled out my phone and pretended to be talking to someone. I walked far further than the first time, until I was very far away, and I placed my phone away. I felt safe for a while, standing there in the rain for a few minutes, and sure enough, the guys were a long distance away from me. But then, there was a loud thunder flash, and that made me jolt. Feeling embarrassed, I looked around to see if anyone saw me, and that's when I spotted it. One of the guys had disappeared from the pack, and I hadn't even noticed him. I had no idea where he'd gone, but I think he must have run into the storm and run all around the station, because when I turned around to look, the man was crouched behind me at the stairs and coming closer. He paused when he saw my eyes on him, and I took that moment to act. I make it sound analytical, but in truth, I was just very shocked, and I was acting frantically. I grabbed my bags and ran straight into the pouring rain. I walked quickly for minutes, before I finally glanced back to see the guys were a long distance away from me. I didn't bother stopping and I walked on. 15 minutes later, and at that point, I was drenched to the bone. Also, the wind had blown my bag open at some point, and I lost most of my school textbook. But it could have been worse. It could have been far, far worse.